The commentators, Guy, Jonquieres, how did we get here?
Thank you, Dirk, and
Yes.
thank you for inviting me and for staging this event. Well, I wish I could share Ganesh's measured optimism about the road ahead and chances of saving the Doha round in particular, but I'm afraid I don't. We're in a mess, and we're not going to get out of it until we actually begin to understand what got us into the mess in the first place. I see four main reasons which I don't think have been fully appreciated, particularly in Geneva, which operates in a kind of little planet all of its own sometimes. Now, the first one is that Doha's troubles are not due primarily to deficiencies in the WTO as an institution, and they will not be solved simply by tinkering with its mechanics. They're rooted in much deeper dysfunctions that affect multilateralism more generally. The problem isn't that the WTO has too many members. The problem is that the ones who matter can't agree on anything. Most of the WTO members hardly do any trade anyway. And those differences extend far beyond trade. You see much the same fault lines in other multilateral forums, most other multilateral forums, but particularly the G20 and the climate change talks. And that is why kicking up the Doha deadlocks up to G20 summits never produces anything, because you've just got the same problems in a different forum. I think it's important to go back a little bit and understand why the post-war multilateral model, which is the one that I grew up with most of my lifetime, no longer works as it used to. And one needs to recognize, first of all, that by a strange paradox, it took a global hegemon to produce this system and to maintain it. Its foundations were laid in an entirely, totally different era, when the US enjoyed quite overwhelming economic, financial, and military power that is never since actually matched on a relative basis, and that power enabled it to set the rules of international cooperation and to ensure that others kept to them. Now, it was motivated to do that because of circumstances that were unique, and which happened to create an identity of US and global interests, which enabled Washington to view its national interest from a broad, long-term perspective that transcended the short-term opportunism. Now, the motive was not primarily economic, it was to do with global security. Initially, it was to prevent a return to the ruinous conditions that led to the Second World War, protectionism, leading to the rise of Nazism, depression, and then, shortly afterwards, it became containing communism. The means was the promotion of the development of prosperous and stable allies, and free trade was one of the tools. Now, come the end of the Cold War, and a central pillar of that geopolitical rationale has been completely undermined. More or less at the same time, two other things happened. First of all, America's economic and financial capacity to bear the costs of leadership has declined. I would date that back to 1971 with the temporary import surcharge and the delinking of dollar from gold, both of which violated central canons of the multilateral system the Americans had themselves set up. And at the same time, of course, we saw the rise of new independent industrial powers around the world, first Europe, then Japan, now China and India, and the rest of the BRICS. All of these new players on the scene now have been emboldened to advance their own interests much more vocally than ever in the past, yet none of them has proved either willing or able to shoulder the important responsibility of global leadership that the US once bore. Now, the result of all this has been a diffusion of power between different centers across the world, which has produced what economists call a state of stable disequilibrium, which basically means muddling through by means of ad hoc compromises and accommodations. And I think if a Martian landed on this planet today and said, who, if anyone, is in charge here, I'm not sure what the answer would be. And I think that until we start to get a sense of what that answer is, it's not going to be clear whether we can move beyond this rather messy state of international relations and start to construct some more coherent model of governance. The second reason for Doha's troubles is profound and complex changes in the structure of the world economy and of international trade that are not really reflected in either the WTO's agenda at the moment, or the rounds agenda, or its negotiating methods. One of the most important is the simultaneous emergence of foreign direct investment as the main driver of global integration, and the reconfiguration of much of world trade around cross-border production networks. And those trends have consequences much too far-reaching to go into right now, and they affect the politics as much as the economics of trade. They have directly challenged the old assumption, which was central to past trade rounds, that the interests of countries and the companies headquartered in them were largely the same. That link now has been broken, and it can have positive benefits. For example, in many developing countries, particularly in Asia, the drive to attract FDI and link deeply into global supply chains has provided a positive impetus for autonomous liberalization. The IT agreement was one good case in point, but there are also very big negatives. In the US and much of the West, multilateral trade liberalization, indeed trade liberalization generally, was traditionally sold to public opinion on the argument that it created jobs at home. But with high and probably long-term structural unemployment in much of the industrialized world, and with companies increasingly siting production wherever they like around the world, that argument has really lost much of its force. And we have yet to find a new one that is capable of rallying public support behind it, at least in most Western countries. Third reason for the problems is China. Not because China's been a troublemaker in the WTO. Actually, if anything, has taken a back seat in the round. It's also created a lot of the world's growth since the crisis. But the problem is that the competitiveness of its exports has created pushback in developing countries as much as in developed ones. And if many developing countries are reluctant to lower or even bind industrial tariffs at their current applied levels, which has been one of the main stumbling blocks to an agreement in the Doha talks, then one of the main explanations is their fear of being overwhelmed by Chinese exports. Such fears are widely shared by and beyond the BRICS countries, which to me raises a number of doubts about how far the BRICS can actually act as a cohesive grouping in any meaningful way in global policy making at present. Finally, the fourth reason is reform fatigue. Trade liberalization almost always yields its biggest benefits when it's closely integrated with policies that aim to bulldoze domestic as well as external market barriers. Yet the great wave of productivity-enhancing, market-oriented structural reforms that surged across much of the world, the US, the EU, China, and other countries in the 1990s has pretty much subsided. And it's been succeeded at best by piecemeal incrementalism, and at worst by backsliding. One can look at a number of cases where that's happened, not just related to the economic crisis. In many countries today, widening economic inequality, stagnating real incomes, and rising popular expectations are all pushing the distribution as opposed to the generation of wealth higher up the policy agenda. There are good reasons why that is happening. But what isn't clear is how far it's going to be possible to meet those pressures, popular pressures, and at the same time undertake the inevitable short-term dislocations and political controversy and opposition that tend to accompany structural reforms, both external ones and domestically. Thank you.
All right, thank you.